Hi there, so this is Sarah from Salt Watercolors, and today we're going to be talking about watercolor papers, so the good, the bad, the acceptably mediocre. I personally like to use 140-pound paper as it's pretty widely available and doesn't cost as much as 300-pound paper. Paper weight refers to the thickness of the paper. The smaller the number, the thinner the paper. Thin papers aren't necessarily worse than thicker papers, but thick papers hold water longer, meaning it takes longer for the paper to dry, which allows you to have more time to work on the paper. When washes are applied on higher quality papers, the water should spread evenly and dry evenly. I don't have my paper completely taped down, and I don't pre-stretch my paper, so I did expect some buckling and warping to occur. Some pigments will radiate outwards more than others when dropped into wet washes. And when working with high quality paper, the pigment should spread fairly consistently and evenly. Almost all pigments will be vibrant when initially applied. Watercolors almost always dry about 40% lighter than when applied, and colors will usually be duller when they are dry. However, vibrance is retained much better when working with good quality paper. Often, colors are quite dull with low quality paper once they have dried. So now we're going to look at how papers handle some finer work. This would be layer 2 that we're going to be working on. So what we're going to be noticing here with this nicer paper is that when I'm going over the first layer that was already set down, the color isn't lifting up. And everything that I've put water on is drying fairly evenly. There aren't any obviously dry spots yet. And I don't have any color warping, so I don't have any extra water spots that are being formed because I put a layer on top of the previous layer. So just to recap here, this is our second layer that we've applied. We haven't lifted up any of the previous paints, or if we have, it's been limited. We haven't seen any, we've got a little bit of water spotting down here, but that's my fault because this wasn't fully dry when I went and added another layer to the sky. So that's on me. But we don't have any water spots forming in our second layer in our sky or down here prior to me doing the sky. Like I said, these are my fault. And once again, the drying time, or the evenness of drying is appropriate. So we don't have any weird dry spots. We don't have any areas where we have excessive puddling because the buckling is out of control. Once again, this is buckling because I don't stretch my paper and I don't have it completely taped down. It would buckle anyways if it was taped down, but because I only have tape in 2 spots and this one side is completely glued together, it could be much worse. Now, our color behaved well. We didn't see any excessive spreading, and the colors have maintained a pretty good vibrancy. This paper, I would say overall, is fabulous. I love working with Arches paper, and I would recommend it to anyone who's looking to get started with watercolor painting. What else can we talk about? So now we're going to work with our intermediate quality paper, and you're going to see some of the characteristics of both the really good and the not so good paper. Obviously, that's why it's intermediate paper, and that's reflected in its cost. So we're going to see some water spotting. We are going to see some lack of vibrancy with certain pigments. Once again, subpigments will flow really well, and some will be a little more inhibited by this type of paper. We're going to see some uneven distribution of drying, and that will be the main cause of our water spots in this case. And alright, so here we can see our intermediate paper after everything is dried, and what you'll first notice is water spots everywhere. They are predominant in this paper. So we're going to see how this paper handles another layer. We're going to see if another layer of paint lifts up the paint underneath, and if it damages the paper, and if it creates more water spots, which is borderline. So what we can see is we have the beginnings of water spots over here. Doesn't look like adding a second layer has really moved a whole lot of the paint from the previous layer, which is nice. We're gonna have another water spot over here because you can tell maybe with the way that the paper is buckling kind of in a wave-like pattern. So we kind of have a similar problem as to the lower quality paper in that the center area is drying again. It is the highest point of the paper because the water is flowing to the edges and this part is buckling up. But we didn't have this problem with the Arches paper. So I would call it a fault, yes, in the way I tape this down, but also an inherent fault within the paper. All right, so here we have what I would consider to be a low quality watercolor paper. I picked it up from Hobby Lobby on clearance for all of $3, and yeah, I would say it behaves exactly like you would expect $3 paper to behave. So what you can expect from this type of paper then is uneven distribution of drying. So some of these areas that I'm putting down water on, you can't really see on the camera, but it's already starting to swell and buckle in areas that I wouldn't really expect a higher quality paper to, and it's already starting to dry. So you can expect uneven drying. You can expect that the color will be less vibrant than it will be with a higher quality paper. And you can expect this type of paper to crumble really easily if you try to lift anything out, which is a pain in the butt if you have something that you're trying to correct, but all of a sudden you're just very gently lifting up and you have paper attached to your brush tip. Even by putting on this wash, the paper is already starting to come up and die. So basically this is like working with 3 sheets of computer paper. Now I should note that some colors are just going to spread beautifully. Having a crap quality paper isn't necessarily going to inhibit every single pigment spreading distribution or ability, but you may notice that the colors do not maintain vibrancy as well, because this is fading really fast. The yellow is hardly being picked up in some areas. So it has been about an hour now, and I tried drying this with the hair dryer for about 10 minutes, and then I gave up because it was still wet and it is still damp in some areas. And this is the, I would call, bottom tier quality paper. And as you can see, the colors are really muted down here. So are the blues. Actually, I'm just going to go ahead and say all the colors are really muted. So it's going to be a bit of a challenge to do this last part with the finer details, but we'll give it a try. See how it goes. Look at that. See how the water's just soaking right into the paper. This paper is so absorbent in the wrong way that I can't even really do a wet into wet. It spreads, but at the same time it doesn't really spread. I don't even know how they can market this as watercolor paper, because it's, like I said earlier, it's like trying to paint on like 3 or 4 pieces of computer paper that have been glued together. But I'll say it again, just because the paper is technically low quality doesn't mean what you produce is going to be low quality. If you have a specific intent behind a painting and you're just starting out, this would be very frustrating to work with. It's good to know what you're getting into instead of trying to use something like this when you're just getting into watercolors and then being vastly disappointed with what you produce because you think it's going to be all on you. It's your skill level that is causing the painting to not be inevitable. And let's get started. So we have water pooling in different spots. One thing with the other paper that is a little bit nicer is it pools, or the paper lifts upwards with this video together, whereas with this one, not like with the previous paper, it lifted upwards from the center and outward, but here we have peaks and valleys in random spots, which is part of the problem. But otherwise, it didn't hold up too bad. The color isn't really washed out, and the paint seems to be responding well with the second layer, so nothing is going crazy, which is nice. So we'll let this dry.